Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Ripley episode 2. It's called Seven Mercies. So spoilers for the episode as always. That's a weird phrase to say. Seven Mercies. Seven Mercies. Seven Mercies. I don't know, for some reason it feels weird to say it. Anyway, welcome to the show. Fletcher sponsors these reviews on Patreon. He had this in both Three Body Problem to pick from. He picked Ripley, so here we are. Doing 2 episodes a month of Ripley. So thanks to Fletcher. This continues the story, of course, where Ripley is now staying on the island. And in an interesting turn of events, the opening section of this episode is him mostly coming clean to Dickie about why he was sent here. Now, that's not me saying that he is being completely honest and he doesn't still have all of his motives and whatnot. It feels very much like a strategical play. He is strategically letting Dickie in on a lot of what he's lied about so far, about his parents sending him to find him, so on and so forth, in the hopes that that will build a bond, that Dickie will see something in that. Clearly, he's decided this is the best play to move forward, and it seemingly works. Dickie thinks this is amazingly funny that his dad did this. He can't believe the gall of it. He wants to tell Marge immediately and tell anyone who'll listen about this crazy idea that his dad had about sending someone to come and bring him back. And he is basically so become like friendly with Ripley that he invites him to stay with him instead of staying at the local hotel. I think one of the running things from the previous episode that's even more extreme this episode is almost anyone who isn't Dickie, whenever they meet Ripley, seems like they just don't believe a word he says and are just grilling him the entire time. It happens with Marge, of course. It happens in this episode with a new character called Freddy, where they just don't seem to believe him. They just seem to be grilling him and asking for details because they don't trust anything he's actually saying. So he's got that uphill battle. One of the things that I was really getting in this episode as well, and it actually does have a payoff in this episode, is that I was starting to feel very uneasy at points in a very sort of cringy way where I was getting worried about Ripley being caught doing something. And it does actually happen towards the end of the episode with Dickie. But there's a couple times where he's like watching Dickie and Marge like from afar through a window, and I thought, oh god, how bad's this going to look if they see him watching? And it was making me feel very uncomfortable in a sort of anticipation kind of way. So they actually do pay that off with a great moment where he spins around towards the end of the episode and Dickie's standing there seeing him do something, which we'll talk about. But it feels like by the end of this episode, Ripley has formed a friendship with him, has planted the seeds for how he somehow might even come between Dickie and Marge. It's a bit of a long play, and I don't necessarily understand all the details quite yet. But I think the end of this episode where Dickie catches him wearing his clothes and pretending to be him, like he's doing the voice. It's almost like the scene from the end of the first episode where he's practicing the phrases in the mirror, but now he's wearing his clothes, including his underwear. Like, Dickie luckily didn't see that part of it, but he takes off his underwear and puts on Dickie's underwear. And I'm like, they're both tighty whities. They look the exact same. It doesn't... But he does that anyway. And I think the end of the episode is kind of a big success for Ripley because ultimately he gets away with this. It's almost like, I don't think he did it intentionally. I don't think he wanted to get caught here, right? I could be wrong. Maybe he was like intentionally pushing his luck, thinking that he should get caught. But I don't think he wanted to get caught. But it ended up being this test. And because Dickie's willing to let it go at the end, because Ripley says, hey, if you want me to leave, I'll leave right now. Like, I'll go in the morning. Dickie thinks about it for a second and just says, no, let's just forget about it. And the final moment of the episode is I'll describe as an almost smile on Ripley's face. Like, he's kind of fighting it, but like he's almost smiling. And we get one last shot of the water, which is also how the episode started as well. And it felt like to me that this test, as much as it was unplanned, perhaps, is basically assured him that this is working. That whatever he's doing to sort of like become close to him, to maybe become between him and his girlfriend, the fact that Dickie decided to let him stay was like, okay, I'm in. Like, if it withstood that, what he just caught me doing, then we're golden here. Now, admittedly, I'm sure it could be broken if he keeps testing him too much, but and it's not the first test in this episode. There's a test earlier on in the episode that kind of threatens where I thought, oh, this could be a reason for Dickie to tell him to get lost. And that's when he brings someone back from the mafia home. Which is such a weird, like, because it plays it. Ripley's getting followed through the streets after he sends a letter, and you're like, well, who is this guy? Is this someone else that the dad sent to check up on what's happening? Ripley knows he's being followed, that he's being watched, and we don't actually get all of the conversation. It's very, again, it's very well paced, it's very well filmed, where they walk a little bit, he goes in and pretends to look at a magazine so he can sort of look over, he's confirming that the guy's following him. It's all very well done, because you feel like you're visually being told a story the entire time. You understand that Ripley's become aware that someone's watching him, and now he's testing the limits to see how much the guy is following him. And then this guy eventually just sort of comes over and starts chatting to him in Italian. But it turns out that this guy wants to hire Ripley, and Ripley sort of brings in Dickie to it, to take a suitcase full of something unknown, something illegal, presumably, to Naples, or from Naples to Rome, I think was I can't remember the exact trip destination off the top of my head, but it was something like that. And Dickie immediately is like, what, are you crazy? I don't want to do that. But you brought this guy to my house? And it's not until after he leaves where he's like, Tom, he's from the mafia. Don't, you brought this guy to my rich villa. He's seeing my jewelry. This is scary. But the notable thing about all this, though, is that Dickie points out that this guy from the mafia seems to treat Ripley like he's one of his own. Not so much that he's part of the mafia, but that he's also some kind of criminal. The idea that he assumes that Ripley's on the level. And he probably got that impression because he noticed that Ripley was noticing that he was being followed. He could tell that Ripley was looking for that, and it was paying attention to those details. And Ripley kind of brings this to Dickie under the guise of like going on an adventure, because one of the things that first kind of bonds them after he comes clean at the start of the episode about his dad sending him is that Dickie says, oh, you basically just did what I did. You saw an opportunity to go on an adventure to somewhere new and exciting, and you took it. So no, there's no hard feelings. We're actually kind of a lot alike based on what you've just done to come on this trip. And I think to some extent Ripley was maybe testing the idea that he would see this as an adventure and that he would want to go on this trip. Now, I genuinely don't know though if he was expecting this reaction, because I feel like he should expect this reaction. And if this was like an intentional sort of like stress test of the relationship at this point. Obviously, he couldn't ask for someone from the mafia to come into the story and give him this opportunity. But at the very least, it feels like since the opportunity presented itself and this mafia guy did come up and offer him this job, I'm not actually sure if Ripley did this thinking that Dickie would like it and it would bond them more over doing something. That seems like the most obvious play here. Or if it was an intentional test to say, oh, we'll see if he takes this bait, and if he doesn't, then I know kind of like where the lines are, and I know where I can operate within. But it's kind of risky, because this could have been enough. Like, you brought someone from the mafia to my house. You're going to have to leave. I don't think anyone would be blaming Dickie for that response if that's what he came out with. Because that's this idea that he is of that world. And there's a really funny moment, actually. One of the funny moments from episode 1 kind of comes back again. Ripley presents him with all the clothes that the mum packed. Specifically for him, I recall. Like, you know, they're giving him a wardrobe, but Ripley presents it as, no, your parents sent all these clothes for you. And Dickie pulls out the bathrobe or whatever it is. And this was the one where in episode 1, Ripley got the color kind of wrong. He said burgundy instead of whatever, or vice versa. When Dickie pulls this out, he starts mocking it and saying, who would wear this? A purple paisley pattern? Who in their right mind? What idiot would wear this? And just watching Ripley's face as he just kind of has to pretend that he agrees with him, when we know that Ripley picked this out, that Ripley thought this was the one that looked like high society. And it's just like a sort of little jolt to him, reminding him that he doesn't really belong here, but he's going to try to. fit in anyway. I really like that moment. Really made me laugh. Other things going through this episode is they go out for like a drink and to see the paintings that were brought up last episode. We also see Dickie's like personal paintings, which are not particular. I mean, I think the paintings he did of the vistas, like of the coast, right? I think they looked okay actually. The simplistic on the detail, but they look pleasant enough. All of the portraits, though, of what was supposed to be Marge, were were pretty bad. They were pretty bad. But they go to an art gallery and see this. What was his name? Caravaggio. That's it. Okay, I got it up because there was no way I was ever going to remember it. It's not settled in my brain yet. But they go and see some of these paintings. They bond a little bit. They see a show with a singer. Notably, when they go to the bank at one point, Ripley's sort of like watching as Dickie's taking out money and signing forms because it sort of reminds the audience that, oh yeah, his game plan ultimately is to steal this guy's identity. So he's paying attention to these things. You remember how tense the scene was in the bank last episode, and then by contrast, how simple this scene is, where Dickie just goes up, signs a couple of things, and gets some money. Easy enough. So some notable things, of course, happen here. They run into this guy named Freddy that's friends with Dickie, and Freddy is very inquisitive. Like, Tom, what's your last name? What do you do in New York? I think I've seen you before. Very, very, very inquisitive. And notably, on the way back on the bus, Ripley kind of starts ripping into Freddy a little bit and saying, "Hey, that Freddy, he's a phony. Like, he says he's a playwright, but like, I don't really believe it. I think he just comes from money and he's not actually doing anything. It's just all a facade." And Dickie kind of like, oh, I won't say that he agrees strongly, but he kind of at least understands what Ripley's saying about it and understands that the point of view that he's coming from. But I think this idea that he's trying to separate Dickie from more of his friends and sort of isolate him so that he's the one true friend. And the other thing that comes from this, and this is kind of interesting in a couple of different ways, is that when they're on their way back to the bus, before they get on the bus, there's a woman with a hurt ankle on the side of the road. And Dickie goes up and helps her up, and there's like a cab nearby, and he takes her to the cab, and he pays the cab driver, and the cab driver asks for more, says it's not enough, so he gives him more money. Basically all the money he's got on him. And he drives off. Now, the two notable things that came out of this. First of all, the scene was beautiful. The wide shot of them walking down the street, obviously it's all in black and white still. Very, very pretty. Point number one is that Ripley points out that was a con. And he's like, what do you mean it was a con? He's like, well, what, a cab just happened to be like 10 feet away from her? No. They're working together and they're splitting that money in the car right now. And notably, Dickie kind of just smiles, shrugs it off and says, well, what if it was? It's worth it just to hear that from a pretty woman. Because the woman said something like, oh, you're the nicest Americans I've ever met. This is the second point, is that Ripley sort of awkwardly sort of smiles and says, yeah, I like girls. And it's just really awkward. It's the least convincing statement that he's made in the show up until this point. And he's made a few unconvincing ones. But Dickie certainly notices that, and obviously by the end of the episode we find out that Marge does think that Ripley is gay, or I think queer was the exact word they used. The idea that Marge isn't so much assuming that Ripley is a like con artist is going to steal the identity, because that is maybe a bit of a extreme thing to jump to, but maybe what she thinks is that Ripley likes Dickie and is trying to worm his way in, because that's the other thing throughout this episode, is whenever they're with her body language, like, I think that's the thing that I'm liking about the show a lot, actually, is how every time there's a conversation between characters, especially when it's like someone else is there, like a third person is there, along with Dickie and Ripley, is that the gaps between the dialogue, the body language, the way they respond. There's a scene where they were helping, Dickie was helping Ripley move in, and they were getting the room ready, and he puts up some of his paintings up in the spare bedroom, and she comes in at the end, and it turns out that she had plans with Dickie to do something, I think just dinner at a restaurant, and he's like, oh sorry, we got cut up setting up the room and stuff, let's go now. And then she awkwardly has to say, oh no, they were closing when I left. And the whole thing is just kind of, there's just this awkward air in the room. And it's doing a really good job of capturing the vibe in specific scenes and letting the performances really breathe and tell the story. Like, you get so much out of this awkward interaction where you can tell she doesn't feel comfortable with Ripley being there, that Ripley is this wedge into their life in some way. And hell, and much like with kind of like testing different things with Dickie, Ripley also tries to test some different things with her, but it's also connected to doing stuff for Dickie because he brings up her not liking him very much, and Dickie says, well, yeah, you try to be nice, but like, you clearly make an effort to be nice rather than just being nice, and that's almost worse. So Ripley shows an interest in what she's doing, what she's writing, like a travel guide kind of thing. She's writing a book with whatever, and he, says that he worked at a publishing house. He wasn't like the editor, but like he'd be happy to take a look at it, and he convinces her to show some of her work. And he takes it away, and he the next day he writes through it and makes notes and suggests changes and stuff. And I thought, oh, this is going to maybe like go badly. Maybe she'll be offended at all the changes he's suggesting or whatever. Instead, she seems pretty receptive after a little bit of an awkward reaction. It seems like a genuine response. It feels like maybe he has won her over just a little bit, at least in the moment. Yeah, honestly, I feel like this is really just to win over Dickie, to show that he's making an effort with her, as opposed to it is him wanting to actually win her over. That's my read on it right now, but I mean, we could go in a number of ways, down the line with the show. But I think these scenes again are so good because of the body language of the actors, because it did feel different. Like, her body language in this scene, when she felt kind of thankful that all these suggestions were actually good, seemingly what was helping her with her her dodgy writing and like whatever. Even the little suggestion he makes for the title by putting the word "my" in front of it is very the Social Network, lose the that's what I was trying to say. Not the Facebook, just Facebook. He adds a "my" before it, so it's "my" whatever rather than just the name of the place. And it does look like a better title. It sounds a bit more personal. It sounds a little bit more whatever. So it feels like he has formed some kind of connection, but of course his ultimate goal is to separate them. And I think that's what he does at the end after he gets caught. Dickie says he's going with Marge. We see them watching at the window a little bit. Like I said, I felt uncomfortable. I thought Ripley was going to get caught there. He doesn't. But he goes home with a letter that Dickie got, and he was also expecting a letter from Dickie's parents, because he sends a letter asking for more money during the episode, and just kind of pretending he's getting close to bringing him back, but he's not quite there yet. All a lie, of course. But he chooses to open the envelope with Steam so he can check that it's a bank letter, basically. He gets the account number out of it and whatever. And the notable thing here is perhaps that the housemaid is paying attention to him and is sort of like noticing that he's up to something. She's kind of eyeing up what he's looking at his table when she comes up to the room to say she's gone out for a bit. But it's when she goes out and he's not expecting Dickie back soon either, that he goes into his bedroom, strips down and puts on Dickie's clothes and does the 2.0 version of pretending to be Dickie. And awkwardly, as he spins round towards the end of this little one-man performance, Dickie's standing there. I actually had to pause it for like 30 seconds because I just felt so awkward about this. It felt so uncomfortable to watch him get caught doing this. Like, how do you possibly explain this? And the funny thing is he never really does explain it, right? He never actually gives a reason for why he was doing what he was doing. And maybe that's because Dickie just assumes that he's attracted to him. And that's, what Dickie brings up. He makes it clear, like, hey, I'm not gay, right? I think you might think I am, but I'm not. And Marge thinks you are. But notably, what happens here, and this kind of feeds into what he was doing when he was performing on his own, because part of it, and this was obviously before Dickie caught him, he was imagining a conversation with Dickie and Marge where Dickie's telling Marge, hey, like, I love you as a friend, but we're not meant to be, or something to that effect. He was basically imagining a breakup, and he was acting it out. We kind of see a shred of that here, where he then puts the idea into Dickie's mind that there's a bit of a disconnect between them because she loves him more than he loves her. And Dickie doesn't deny that. He just says, yeah, but like, that doesn't mean I don't care about her. That doesn't mean that I'm not passionate. I think Ripley says, you know, who reaches for whose hand and things like that. And that's when Ripley says, look, I don't want to come between a friendship or a relationship, so I'll dip out. Like, I'm not, like, I want to get in between anything. This has tested the bounds of this, and surprisingly, well, not surprisingly because it's a TV show and obviously the show has to continue, but in the vacuum of, like, if you were in this moment, I would say it's surprising that Dickie says, no, it's, you know what, let's just forget about it, and he walks off with a drink in his hand and, like, gives Ripley his pardon the phrase, happy ending. I think it's interesting watching Dickie as a character and as to why he seems so interested in keeping Ripley around. And obviously that's something that Ripley himself is having to juggle. Like, what about Ripley is appealing to Dickie? Obviously the idea that his father sent him to come get him suggests that he was not manipulated, that's not quite the right word, but the idea that his father tried to use him in the same way that his father's always tried to use himself, kind of thing. Like, I think there's maybe some interesting ways he relates to him there, and that's why he wants to, like, be friends with him. But obviously there's a lot of orchestration here. There was a moment early on with Ripley where he put, I think he was putting the pen back on the table now that I'm thinking about it, but I just wanted to mention that at the start. It's another solid episode. I don't think it's quite as tight from, like, start to end as the first episode, just purely because it's got, you know, it's got that episode 2 thing going for it where we've established things now, but we're still kind of, like, now in that period where we're adding some layers to it, we're gearing things up a little bit, but we're not at the other end of the spectrum yet where we're really paying big dramatic payoffs. But what I do think it does is that all of the performances in every scene where there's, like, 3 characters interacting, and the way that Dickie seems cool with Ripley being around, and I really do question as to why. Like, is this a genuine friendship to him in some way that he seems that is forming? Is he using Ripley in some way, in the way that a rich person might use someone they see as lesser just purely for entertainment's sake? Given that we keep playing with this idea that Ripley's in over his head when he, you know, doesn't know what the good fashion is, and he feels embarrassed about that, you know, whether openly to other characters or not, or doesn't know who the painter was in episode 1 and he's trying to pretend that he is. I do wonder if we get to, and I don't know where this story's going, I've never seen any version of this story before. I do wonder if the idea here is that ultimately, if Dickie is just using him for entertainment and that's why he's keeping him around, and he is a bit of a Dickie head, I suppose, that could be what pushes Ripley over the edge, right? Maybe the idea that Ripley is good at being a con man to an extent, although we did talk a lot in episode 1 that he's not actually that good at it. Like, he's, you know, he's got experience with it, but he's not amazing at it. But even though he might be good at that, he might actually be worse at the emotional manipulation, and that it's actually him that's been more manipulated here at this point than it is the other way around. But again, like, I feel like, honestly, it's kind of open for a lot of things right now. I'm sure people who know the story well are probably, I don't know, or probably don't know how to take this theorizing because it's just a story they already knew before they started watching the show. But for me, there is a sort of sense of discovery to this, and as to, like, where these characters are going to go and end up. Obviously, we know there's eventually going to be a death, but, like, other than that, I'm like, you know, what leads to that death? Exactly how we end up there. You know, was that in? I want to say that was in maybe one of the locations that the mafia guy was talking about earlier. Maybe eventually Ripley does take that job. You know, that's still dangling. You know, they don't pay that, wrap that up in this episode. So he could still want to go on that job at some point. Maybe that's just how he tries to run away eventually, or maybe Dickie does want to go on that job at some point. You know, maybe something does inspire him to do it. Maybe he will want that sense of dangerous adventure down the line. Yeah, there's a lot going on. It's a lot of good character setup to the point where I'm really enjoying just paying attention to the subtleties in the scenes, as opposed to just like rampaging through plot like a lot of shows do. Which is not to say that it's slow paced to me either. I feel like the pacing here is pretty good. I have not felt any kind of get moving here, because it is a show that's going to take time. Simple little things like when we go into Margie's like place for the first time in this episode, it takes time to show a bunch of shots of the various things around the room, her photographs that are next to her manuscripts and things like that. And it's almost like it is emulating this idea of like Ripley scanning the room for, because he's always thinking about what he can use or how he can, like, is there anything here that he can use later on to his advantage? Is there something that he can do? And she she notices him looking at her one of her photographs. She even has a sort of passive aggressive line once they're sitting talking about, what are you going to look at next? And then she says, "Oh, I mean in Italy." Like, she passes it off as like, "Oh, where's he going to go next?" But it didn't feel like that when she said it. It felt like she was talking about how are you going to pry into like our lives next. Kind of was how I felt like it was meant to come across in the moment. But anyway, that's episode 2 of Ripley. I am very curious to see where it goes next. So yeah, this will be twice a month. Fletcher, of course, is sponsoring this on Patreon. You can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV. And even if you're not going to be on the tiers where you're sponsoring shows, every single dollar does count and does help support the channels, and is what lets me keep doing this the way I have been doing it. So you can check out the movie channel if you haven't checked out the movie podcast, MailFuzz Movies. But otherwise, that is me. Hit the like button. All the usual things apply. Any support in any way is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for joining me. Let me know what you thought of this episode of Ripley in the comments, and I will see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?